So your moderator today is Ana Guerrero from FCM. Ana, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining us today. As Luis mentioned, my name is Ana Guerrero. I am the Capacity Building Coordinator for the Municipalities for Climate Innovation Program, and I will be moderating today. So let's just begin. I will quickly go through the agenda. So firstly, we'll talk briefly about FCM, the objectives of the webinar, and some of the results from the registration survey. Then we will listen to Michael Dean from ICLEI Canada speak about exploring mitigation and adaptation strategies and synergies, followed by 2 case studies, one presented by Anna Mathewson, the Manager of Sustainability with the Sustainability Office at the City of Surrey. And the second one will be Jeremy Shembry, Manager of Climate Change and Energy Management at the Region of Peel. As Luis mentioned, we will save questions for the end, but feel free to ask as we go on the chat to the left, and we will be keeping track of them and try to cover as many as possible. If we don't get to all, Anna, Jeremy, and Mike will respond offline, and we will circulate these responses with the presentations after the webinar. So to get started, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities has been the voice of local governments to the federal government since 1901, advocating on issues of municipal interest that fall within federal jurisdiction. Most recently, FCM launched the Municipalities for Climate Innovation Program to help municipalities prepare for and adapt to climate change and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. For more information, feel free to contact me, and my information will be at the end of the presentation. So some of the objectives for this webinar, as you may already know, are understanding the link between climate change adaptation and GHG emissions reduction planning, learning how to implement adaptation and GHG emission reduction actions together, recognizing successful policies based on lessons learned from other municipalities, and discovering examples of plans that have successfully incorporated adaptation and mitigation together. So now, before we continue, I wanted to take the time to thank everyone for your comments on the registration survey. We did our best to incorporate some of your expectations in the presentations, and we will be taking some additional steps to ensure the conversation keeps going. So something we heard was having opportunities to follow up and network with other participants. So for those that are in the call that are also part of the Partners for Climate Protection program, you can join our online networking tool, the PCP Hub. This is free, and you can find a group on this webinar. So this particular group will become a library of resources and a place to ask questions if they emerge after the webinar. Anna, Mike, and Jeremy will be the leaders of this group, and they will have agreed to respond to questions afterwards. And yes, hopefully this is a place where everyone can share some of their experiences and resources. Secondly, there was a suggestion of having an executive summary to circulate with senior managers and other team members that can attend. So I will be taking notes and circulating as well after this webinar, just a one-pager with some bullet points. And lastly, we will circulate the presentations at the end and answer the questions, as I mentioned before. So without further ado, I will introduce Michael Dean, who is the Climate and Energy Program Coordinator for ICLEI Canada. Michael brings substantial experience in emissions quantification and climate action planning at a local scale. He is the technical lead on the Partners for Climate Protection program, where he creates tools, resources, and technical guidance to Canada's largest network of cities working on local climate mitigation. Michael is also a World Bank certified urban GHG accounting specialist and has recently worked with GHG accountant, climate mitigation, and community energy planning projects in the municipalities of Woodstock, Newmarket, Vaughan, Peterborough, Oakville, Windsor, and others. He led the technical components of York's region's updated conservation demand management plan and has developed training webinars to cities across Canada that are helping or that are thinking of reporting to the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. Michael has a Master's of Science in Planning from the University of Toronto, and today we'll be talking about exploring mitigation and adaptation synergies. Michael.
Thank you, Anna. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. as Anna said, I am the Climate and Energy Program Coordinator here at ICLEI Canada. We are one of the Partners for Climate Protection along with FCM. We also run the BARC program, the Building Adaptive and Resilient Communities program, which is Canada's only national program on adaptation planning for local government. So I won't take too much of your time today because I think it's sort of more interesting to hear from Anna and Jeremy on the sort of on-the-ground stuff that they're working on, but I just want to highlight some of the, I think, key themes, a resource on how to align climate change mitigation and adaptation planning, and just one sort of example from the work that I've been involved in that I think kind of really shows how these two areas can interact usefully. So moving along. So, you know, really we're talking here today about balancing climate mitigation and adaptation. This can be done and typically is done through a variety of approaches. You know, one way is through a sort of single combined plan that helps, that combines both adaptation and mitigation actions and attempts to use those together to satisfy those sort of shared broader sustainability objectives. There's also sort of processes that involve integrating adaptation assessments prior to creating a GHG reduction action plan, and also a sort of approach which seems to be a little bit more common among the people who are who responded to our survey beforehand, which kind of involves integrating a adaptation plan once a mitigation plan has been developed and sort of looking at how existing actions can affect adaptation efforts and sort of maximize co-benefits. So, you know, when we're talking about adaptation and mitigation, you know, really mitigation is about reducing the number of greenhouse gases that enter the atmosphere, the quantity of greenhouse gases, and sort of reducing the impacts of climate change or reducing the extent of climate change. And then adaptation is really about responding to the impacts that, you know, we can't avoid. And so, you know, these two areas sort of impact our communities in a variety of ways. And so the real question is, how can we effectively respond? And so what we're talking about here today really is responding with a comprehensive response strategy that integrates both mitigation and adaptation into planning effectively and reduces conflicts between those two goals, because they can be in conflict, and it's important to understand how they can conflict with each other in order to minimize those conflicts. So just wanted to highlight here a recent report that was released by the Adaptation to Climate Change team out of SFU. It was produced as a result of a workshop that was held at ICLEI's Livable Cities Forum that we hold every year. And really it sort of provides a really, I think, valuable perspective on why pursuing adaptation and mitigation together, specifically really focused on clean infrastructure, is important. You know, and they really talk about how doing so can help you achieve multiple co-benefits through aligning those two approaches. It really allows you, and I think this is a really interesting idea, it allows you to expand your potential pool of funding sources by positioning actions as being both climate mitigation and climate mitigation or adaptation actions. So an area that, you know, might fund adaptation, you can kind of draw on that pool by positioning these actions within that area. It really helps you increase the return on investment for the actions that you're undertaking, because essentially it allows you to recognize how those types of actions meet other goals. You know, something that's a energy strategy might help reduce energy costs, but it might also build a more resilient grid and help you avoid costs from damage that could occur through storms and that sort of thing. So it's really important to sort of think about those additional benefits. And then really, what it really helps to do is it helps to save time and resources and accelerate implementation, because really you're doing these two things together, and so you don't have the problem of having to reassess your strategies or pursue totally different divergent strategies when in fact they could reinforce and support each other. So this is just sort of a kind of high-level visual representation of what this climate, this resource sort of means when it talks about what they call green resilience strategies. So, you have on the outside there, really actions that are specifically adaptation focused, and actions on the other hand that are, specifically mitigation focused. But when you bring them together in the middle, what you really find is that together they form a much stronger suite of actions that can meet those multiple demands, through green infrastructure, through building resilient, sustainable urban transport systems, through, efficiency programs that also serve to make buildings more resilient. And so together, they really reinforce each other, and they allow you to pursue a more effective strategy for both climate mitigation and adaptation. So just in the time that I have left, I just wanted to highlight one example that I think really brings us home, and that's really the question of emerging approaches to energy systems. So, we know that power outages have been increasing as a result of weather-related events. This graph shows the trend in the U.S., but it's much the same in Canada. You have major outages in power systems, and these are often caused by large-scale storm events, and they can cause significant hardship to affected communities. It disrupts economies. It has real problems for people. At the same time, decarbonizing the energy grid is vital to achieving our sustainability goals. Electricity is about 11% of our emissions in 2014. That figure's a little bit old, but it's probably not too different now. And it's much more in certain provinces where the grid is more carbon intensive. And really, as we start to pursue certain mitigation strategies like electrification of transportation grids and thermal and heating, the clean energy has the potential to replace those sort of carbon-intensive sources, so it's really important that we get that right. And together, you can really see how these start to, an emerging sort of approach to designing energy systems can help serve both those goals, really through the development of these sort of renewable distributed energy generation grids, a shift from a centralized generation model to a distributed model where energy production happens within municipalities, where you have these, they're often called prosumers, where essentially you're producing energy and consuming energy in a variety of sites across the community. These types of networks are much less linear, much more integrated, and they can help, they often rely on locally generated renewable energy. And so it obviously helps serve mitigation goals, but it serves those adaptation goals, because these types of grids are much more resilient to shocks, because there's not one point that can disrupt them quite so simply if they're designed correctly. And that's a key point also here, and the last one I'll make, because for example, in Superstorm Sandy in the U.S., there was, I think, something like 20,000 or more renewable energy, like local solar systems. But when the grid went down, all of those systems stopped providing electricity because they were tied to the grid. They weren't able to separate from the grid and run independently. And so they essentially weren't able to serve that resilience goal or purpose that you'd think they would be able to serve. And so thinking that through when you're designing these systems is very important, right? It doesn't do it automatically. It only does it if you pay attention. So really, hopefully that sort of helps highlight some of these concerns where, or these issues where, we're really looking at changing our approach to designing energy systems to position them in such a way that they can serve those mitigation goals and serve those resilience and adaptation goals consciously. And in doing so, it's really a lot easier to sell that concept of why this sort of transition is necessary, right? Because a program that might not be justified just on the basis of the carbon mitigation impact can possibly be justified on the basis of the ability to help your community withstand shocks from severe weather events. So those are my comments. Hopefully that was helpful. And I think now I will pass it along to Jeremy, who will give an example of how these sort of adaptation and mitigation goals are being integrated in a plan that they're working on.
Yeah, and before Jeremy gets started, I'm just going to introduce him. So Jeremy Shembry is the manager of the recently created Office of Climate Change and Energy Management at the Region of Peel. He has the privilege of impacting positive change for his corporation and community through the promotion and implementation of sound climate change mitigation and adaptation measures. So Jeremy, thank you for joining us, and I'll let you go.
I'd like to start today by thanking everyone for the opportunity to speak to you about the Region of Peel's journey in incorporating climate change adaptation and mitigation into a single plan, which we are affectionately referring to here at the Region of Peel as the Corporate Climate Change Master Plan. Yes, it's a corporate plan, which I do plan on speaking to in the coming slides. This is still truly a journey as we are in the process of developing our plan, though I would be happy to share with you any of the early learnings that we've experienced so far, and what was the drivers that helped push forward this plan into creation and to where we are today. So I understand that people from across the country are taking part in this webinar, so I thought it would be appropriate to share a little bit about the Region of Peel. We are a regional municipality. We're constituted of the town of Caledon, the city of Brampton, and the city of Mississauga. We neighbor the city of Toronto and are home to Pearson Airport. So those of you who have flown into or driven across southern Ontario, you would likely have visited Peel.
Jeremy, excuse me, we can hardly hear you. Could you please speak up?
Okay, thank you. We are Ontario's second largest municipality and rapidly growing. We share service responsibilities with our local municipalities. The provision of water, wastewater, paramedics, police, waste management, and public housing have been examples of what the Region of Peel's services are and are the focus of our Corporate Climate Change Master Plan. So, for close to a decade, reducing greenhouse gas emissions has been recognized as a priority for the Region of Peel. We've been tracking our corporate greenhouse gas emissions since 2010, and as you can see from this graph, we've experienced significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this is partly related to a series of mitigation actions occurring at the region during this time period, but more largely due to the provincial government's decision to close
Jeremy, I think you're slipping away from your mic somehow. Can you speak up again?
Sure. I'll turn up the volume on my phone as well. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. So we do understand that a good hunk of this reduction, though, is the result of the province's coal plants being closed down and the cleaning of Ontario's electricity grid. So with that understanding and a full understanding that we've been a benefactor of this decision, we recognize that an integrated, comprehensive climate change plan will be necessary if we're going to achieve the absolute emission reductions needed to meet our 2050 target, which is to be 80% below 1990 levels, as you can see on this graph. Now, this graph, I should just reiterate, is our corporate greenhouse gas emissions and doesn't represent the entire community's emissions. But that's been, again, the focus of this of our work to date. In parallel to the region's mitigation work, we're also been active assessing the impact that a change in climate could have on our community through the completion of climate change models and a series of vulnerability assessments that have brought forward findings that have helped shed light on the need for future planning and action on the climate change adaptation front. Some of the key findings were that the Peel will experience in the coming years a 117% increase in days of over 30 degrees temperatures, a 27% increase in average temperature, and an 8% increase in precipitation, which is largely due to more intense rainfalls. These findings led us to ask if higher temperatures, more heat waves, more dry spells, extended spring and fall, more freeze-thaw cycles, more fall, winter, and spring precipitation, more intense rainfalls, and higher wind speeds were to happen, how could this impact Peel's operations and services? With this question in mind, we assess climate change risks with if, then, and so statements, with staff representing all divisions at the Region of Peel. And the top 3 impactful climate change drivers were the following: more intense rainfalls, leading to things like increased flooding; extended shoulder seasons, leading to increased algae bloom, which affects our water services; and more heat waves, leading to higher health risk, which has a direct impact on our public health services. However, overall, it was determined that these types of events would directly impact 1/3 of the services that are provided through the Region of Peel. So it was definitely something that we recognized needed additional attention. So the need for action was apparent. Using this information to align with the priorities of the organization and senior leadership was essential. Once the alignment was clear, milestone actions such as the creation of a Climate Change Energy Management Office and a Council Climate Change Statement of Commitment set the course and direction for an integrated corporate climate change mitigation and adaptation plan. For municipalities the size of the Region of Peel, an Office of Climate Change and Energy Management plays an important role in ensuring that climate change is incorporated into decision making. So depending on the size of your municipality, I don't know that this is a standalone office is always needed. What I would say that is important is that there are representatives within your organization that are focused on the climate change topic and promoting climate change thinking into your organization's decision making. Added to that is having a statement of commitment or a position statement on climate change further strengthens the voice of that individual or group within your organization, and also provides greater clarity for all staff when we're talking about climate change, but also prioritizing different priorities within your municipality. The goals for our master plan were to mitigate the cause of climate change and to adapt to the effects of climate change. No easy undertaking, but we were quite happy that our senior leadership had made these goals and the completion of a climate change plan a corporate priority. Based on the findings that I briefly went over earlier, it was important that the plan had both a mitigation and adaptation component. It was also understood that considering these actions in isolation of each other would be a lost opportunity and, of course, in some cases, be counterproductive.
Jeremy, I'm afraid you're fading out again. Can you readjust?
Okay, nothing's changed on my end, but can you hear me now?
Yes, better.
Okay, I apologize.
Keep up that volume, that would be good.
Okay, so I'll go back to where it was understood that considering these actions in isolation would be a lost opportunity, and it could also be counterproductive. The Region of Peel, like many municipalities, has made great inroads on the mitigation front compared to our progress on the adaptation front. Now, this isn't a bad thing. It's just an evolution of the field of study that was mitigation-centric in the beginning, and in recent years has had a growing attention given to adaptation. This is an important reality for the Region of Peel to acknowledge and accept for us to proceed with an integrated plan. Once this was acknowledged, it brought to light why some people within the organization may have viewed adaptation as an unknown and something that they consciously or unconsciously were trying to avoid. It also addressed the reality, that, for Peel at least, that mitigation and adaptation files were in different places. And though it may be tempting to proceed with the work that we were more familiar with, there was an undeniable need for us to move forward on the adaptation file. This meant that we could not pause on adaptation work while we completed the mitigation work. We moved forward with an understanding that our plan had to look at both topics, but that did not mean that they had to look the same way within the plan. While the region's more mature mitigation file is positioned to explore more complex, innovative technical solutions within the plan, the adaptation work would likely be more focused on building capacity within the organization and getting it to the point that we currently were at with mitigation. The point being that once it was agreed that our plan will continue to evolve, and at this point in time, the adaptation and mitigation components did not necessarily need equal space and complexity, there was greater comfort across the organization to include both topics within one plan. Another highly discussed topic for our plan was, should it be a corporate or community plan? And in the case appeal, this conversation was aided by direction from our senior leadership team, which noted that the need for leadership and successes to build the momentum in our community was a must, meaning that the region is not in an ideal position to ask the community to take action on climate change if we cannot exhibit the leadership and provide examples ourselves. The difficulty that we've encountered in trying to delineate corporate and community is how intertwined and impacted our corporate services are by community influence. This has made some interesting discussions when trying to manage the scope of our plan. For instance, we can improve the efficiency of pumps at our water plants, but that would not necessarily result in reductions in emissions if our communities continue to use an increased amount of water. So this is something that we acknowledge and are looking at ways that we can bridge the community and corporate components within our corporate plan. I should note also that though this plan is corporately focused, that does not mean that the Region Appeal has disregarded the community when thinking about climate change. In reality, we actually have a Appeal climate change partnership that is focused much more on the community front, and it's a joint group with the Region Appeal, the local municipalities, and the conservation authorities, which is an effective model for reaching out into the community and ensuring that voices across our region are heard. This final slide is a high-level overview of the approach that we've taken to complete this work, but most importantly, it highlights the significant value that we've placed on staff engagement to co-design solutions and validate actions, which at the end of the day will be implemented by these same divisions across the Region Appeal, which share in the responsibility of implementation. You see that all levels of staff have been engaged, from the formation of a director-level corporate climate change committee to manager-level working groups to staff engagement sessions with broader staff to inform and solicit ideas. And as you'll see, it might be worth noting also, for our broader staff engagement sessions, what we did was the creation of climate control rooms, which was both an information sharing, but also an opportunity for us to get ideas from our staff. So it served two purposes, which was an effective use of everyone's time, which is another key part of this whole exercise, was being mindful of all the staff's time in the development of this plan. So as you can see, we are now entering into the development of our master plan and implementation strategy with the intention to have a completed plan in the second quarter of 2018. And so that's where we currently are at, and I'll be happy to take any questions at the end of this presentation.
Thank you, Jeremy. Yeah, we have one question that we'll ask at the end, but thanks for that brief overview on your corporate integrated plan. Now I'm going to be introducing Anna Mathewson. Anna has a master's degree in research management from SFU with a focus on sustainable community development and is a member of the Canadian Institute of Planners. She worked for several years in the BC Treaty process, including as senior advisor to the BC Treaty Commission, monitoring the negotiation process and mediating disputes. Anna then managed the Fraser River Estuary Management Program and the Burrard Inlet Environmental Action Program, two intergovernmental partnerships program focused on the environmental management of those two water bodies. Since 2009, Anna has been the manager of sustainability for the City of Surrey, where her role is to be a catalyst for sustainability within the city, both on the corporate and community side. Previously a board member for the Fraser River Discovery Center, Anna now sits on the advisory board of the Kwantlen Polytechnic University Policy Studies, and she was recognized as a member of Canada's 2016 Clean 50 and Clean 16, recognizing her role as a sustainability leader in Canada. So thank you, Anna, for joining us, and I'll let you speak now.
Thanks, Anna. Happy to be here, everyone. I'll be speaking to Surrey's Community Climate Action Strategy. So just to start off, I guess, with a few overview slides about Surrey. For those that don't know, we're the second largest city in British Columbia. We have a population now, it's a little over 500,000 people, and we have a really big mix of land uses. We're geographically quite large. We have urban areas, we have a lot of suburban land use, we have rural, and we have agricultural and industrial. We have the Fraser River, of course, so we're characterized by a major river and an ocean boundary, which is important for our adaptation pieces. Just a graphic here to show you our population density, obviously denser in our city centers, and on the top is our kind of the north area there is our city center. We have 1/3 of our land in the agricultural land reserve, so that's that swath of kind of light green that you see on the slide there. So a significant amount of our land is protected in the agricultural land reserve, and another chunk of land, 8,500 hectares, is within the floodplain. So this is just to give you a sense of the density and the land use. And when we move to population growth, like Peel and like a lot of other cities that are on this call, we're a rapidly growing city. We've had huge amount of population growth over the last 10 years particularly. And the other thing to note about Surrey, a couple of things. One is that we're a really young city, so we have 1/3 of our population under the age of 20. And another is that we're a very diverse city. We have 30% of our population speaking Hindi, Punjabi, Chinese, and Tagalog at home. So moving on to the climate commitments, the focus of our call today. Again, like a lot of cities on the call, we've made a number of climate commitments at different levels. We signed on to the BC Provincial Climate Action Charter. We are members of the Partners for Climate Protection program federally through FCM and ICLEI. We actually reached milestone 5 on the corporate and community mitigation side, and we've also more recently reached milestone 5 on the adaptation side through the ICLEI BARC program. And in 2015, our mayor signed on to the global, what's now known as the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. So these are really all of those kind of high-level political commitments around greenhouse gas reduction targets, kind of mitigation and adaptation. Moving on to talk to the climate strategy, we have those political commitments like I was referencing, and then we also in Surrey have a sustainability charter. That sustainability charter, I don't have a slide on it here, but it's our overarching policy document for the city. It was first approved in 2008, and we updated it last year in 2016, and that also, along with our official community plan, which is our land use plan, really provides the kind of policy impetus for doing a climate strategy. The official community plan in particular, our land use plans in British Columbia, we were all mandated as BC cities to require greenhouse gas reduction targets in there back in 2010. So that's where our targets sit. So all of that combined to lead us to create a community climate action strategy. We started that work in 2011, and it was approved by our council in 2013. And the way that we went about that is we developed 2 plans in tandem. We have a mitigation plan, which we call our Community Energy and Emissions Plan, or our CEEP, and we have an adaptation strategy as well. And we followed somewhat different processes. I know many of you on the call, it's interesting, you have a mitigation only, there's a smaller number that have adaptation only, and I think that's probably where some of the questions might be around. For us, we decided to develop these in tandem, and remember this is a few years ago, before a lot of the dialogue that's present right now around resilience and a lot of the work coming out of U.S. cities in particular, combining these issues, but at the time, it was kind of a newer thing to do. There weren't a lot of cities that had done a plan that combined them. We ended up doing them separately, but in tandem, and we followed somewhat different processes. So on the mitigation side, we got some green municipal funding, which was super helpful. We hired a consultant, HB Lanark Golder, to do that work with us. We did a lot of modeling and so on, and that SEEP, that energy and emissions plan, like your plans probably, it sets out strategies for reducing emissions in a number of areas such as land use, transportation, and so on. The adaptation strategy, we were able to be part of a pilot with a few other local governments where we used the ICLEI framework, the kind of 5-step framework for developing an adaptation strategy. And we developed that one largely internally using that ICLEI framework. Now that visual you're seeing in the top right there, what that was like a third document, a third piece that we created. And as we were getting to the end of the long planning process for both these plans, we developed that third piece. And that third piece was really a linkage document. It provided some of the background and rationale for working on climate issues. It talked about our targets and policy commitments and so on. But then it also outlined linkages that we started to identify between mitigation and adaptation, and that's the focus of my next slides. Just briefly on adaptation priorities, I just thought I'd mention, I'm kind of talking to the habitat and passive building design later, but I just thought I'd mention Surrey's doing a lot of work on sea level rise. Being a coastal city, it's not surprising that it was identified as our highest priority risk, sea level rise and flooding. And we're in the midst of a coastal flood adaptation strategy that's being led through our engineering department, where we're working with stakeholders in the public to have a dialogue, to start a dialogue really around what's already happening around sea level rise that we're seeing in our city and how we're going to come up with some, what kind of strategies we want to put in place to deal with it. And then really briefly on the mitigation side, I know we were talking before about Peel being fast-growing, Surrey being fast-growing. It's a challenge to reduce emissions and to have these really ambitious greenhouse gas reduction targets when you're a fast-growing city. That's big for us, but some of the key pieces that we're working around mitigation, one is a district energy system that I'll speak to later. Another is a biofuel facility that we're building. It's about to open this month. It's going to take the organic waste that we collect around the city and create renewable natural gas with that waste, which will then power the waste collection trucks and a number of other fleets and so on. And then we're building light rail along 3 of our major corridors in Surrey. So these are just some of the pieces we're working on, but they're kind of the big ones when it comes to reducing emissions, and particularly with light rail having a real city impact in terms of densification long term. This next slide, we adapted it from the City of Toronto, and it's in that overarching document that I was mentioning, that kind of third piece. It's similar to what Michael put up, and I think actually the one Michael showed was probably better, but it essentially shows, you know, what you're working on mitigation and what you're working on adaptation and some of those linkage areas. And whether that's, you know, I should have put a question mark around resilience. I think for every city, resilience is different, but I know in the graphic from the SFE report, they termed this green resilience. So it's really just to identify some of those linkage areas. And in the next slide, I borrowed this from somebody who works for the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, USDN. It really just tries to identify making sure that you're working on measures that have strong adaptation and mitigation co-benefits. So I thought that might be helpful to just plug into the presentation here. So moving along, I've got really 4 linkage areas that I'm going to speak to, and those are what are outlined in that overarching document. And I think, you know, when I read through these or when I talk about these things, you'll see, I'm sure that your cities are already working on a lot of these issues, but these were the 4 that a few years back we identified as linkage areas between mitigation and adaptation. So the first is around kind of really land use, you know, compact land use, protecting ecosystems and green space and avoiding hazard areas. And that's really about focusing growth in our urban areas, which we all know is part of lowering greenhouse gas emissions, but at the same time protecting green space and improving stormwater management and protecting ecosystem services. And the tools that we use in Surrey for this, we have Plan Surrey is our official community plan, which looks at land uses and outline land uses across the city. And and part of that, I should say too, is development permit areas. So we have development permit areas that protect sensitive ecosystems, and we have development permit areas that actually are special requirements for development or alteration of land in those hazard lands. So that's around that hazard avoidance of steep slopes and kind of flood-prone areas, and limiting development in those areas. And those are areas that, when you think about adaptation and impacts from climate change, will be more subject to change in the future. And another piece I just want to reference here is our biodiversity conservation strategy, and that's also that little map that's showing of the hubs and corridors. So in 2014, Surrey developed a biodiversity conservation strategy, and that's really looking at a green infrastructure network of these hubs and corridors throughout the city. It's about 10,000 acres of land that we've identified as required for ecosystem services, some of which we already own and manage in the form of parks, but a lot of which has to be acquired over time through development. And that goal of that biodiversity conservation strategy is to preserve and protect biodiversity in the long term. So that's really about that protection of green space and looking at ecosystem services, which has the adaptation benefit. I'll move on to the next linkage area. It's somewhat related. It's around ecosystem health and carbon sequestration, and that's really looking at healthy trees and ecosystems. So looking at the ecosystem services that those provide us in our cities around water and air quality, shade, wind protection, reducing erosion, mitigating flood and stormwater runoff. So those are all natural services that increase our resilience to climate impacts, and at the same time absorbing carbon from the atmosphere. So I've already talked about biodiversity conservation. I'll just mention the Shade Tree Management Plan. So that's a plan that was developed last year. It's really our blueprint for how we're going to maintain our public property shade trees. We have about 75,000 street trees and 21,000 park trees outside of our natural forest, which is dealt with separately, and we're planting about 5,000 shade trees a year. And this shade tree management plan identified adaptation. It kind of flowed from our climate adaptation strategy. It identifies that as a key objective in managing shade trees, and it's really looking at best practices, so looking at, right tree at the right time in the right place, among other strategies. Linkage number 3, a lot of cities we know are working on these things. So it's around heat management and passive solar strategies that essentially improve thermal performance. They reduce greenhouse gases from buildings. So there's the mitigation benefit. And then in terms of adaptation, they're reducing urban heat island impact, and they're moderating health risks during the heat wave. So it's about designing climate resilient buildings and nurturing trees as well as part of passive solar design strategies, and that reduces energy use in buildings. A couple of the tools that we have in Surrey, one is a provincial tool. That graphic on the right is a graphic from the BC Energy Step Code. Ted Sheldon on the call knows way more than I do about this, but it's essentially a strategy that's been developed for BC cities to prepare for net zero new construction by 2032, and it provides clear steps that cities can sign on to move towards that, and it's something that's being supported by the development industry in British Columbia. The graphic on the left is a tool that we developed as well last year. It's an energy efficient building guide, and that was for planners and developers and architects to give them guidance document about how to incorporate passive design features into buildings in Surrey. So those are just a couple of the pieces there. And this, I think it was Jeremy or it was Mike referencing, energy as well as food. So the fourth linkage that we identified in our climate strategy, linking these issues of mitigation and adaptation, were energy systems, community energy systems like district energy, as well as food. And on the energy side, in Surrey, we have a district energy system in our city center. It's based on geoexchange. There's some natural gas use within it, and we have kind of a service area bylaw, first of all, that's requiring connection to the district energy system, and then we're just exploring with some funding from MSIP how to decarbonize or lower the carbon intensity of that district energy system over time. So Surrey City Energy is a city-owned and run energy utility for that system. So that's kind of looking, obviously district energy we know reduces GHGs, and by integrating those renewable energy supplies, like Mike was speaking to earlier, decreasing the carbon intensity of those systems, you're increasing your resilience. You're also increasing resilience to fluctuating energy prices as well. The food piece, Surrey I was mentioning, has a lot of ag land. We have a lot of active farms that serve the whole Greater Vancouver area. Our adaptation strategy spoke to things like diversifying crops and working with the ag production community on a number of kind of issues. So we have an agricultural protection and enhancement strategy, and like a lot of cities, we're working on food assets and community gardens and other kinds of ways to reduce the kind of diversify our crops, which is reducing the transportation emissions associated with bringing food into the city, but also providing greater resilience on the food side. I'm probably running out of time, so just really quickly, there's a couple of other programs that we're working on. I'll mention just that Newton Sustainability and Action Plan. It's funding that we got through GMF for Sustainable Neighborhood Planning, and we've just kicked it off this summer, where we're developing a local sustainability plan. It's the first that we've done in Surrey, and it's a pilot for us, and it's in a neighborhood that has a lot of vulnerability. And so we're trying to integrate within that mitigation pieces as well as adaptation pieces, and it's a collaborative plan with the community that's underway. We're doing some work as well on Urban Heat Island. I was mentioning that in that linkage around design and so on. Portland, City of Portland's done some great work with Portland State University around Urban Heat Island, where they've mapped it. We're working with those same researchers in Surrey to essentially get a better understanding of urban heat island impacts in our city, and from that I think we'll be able to then understand maybe it can influence our tree canopy or tree planting or street tree planting, the kinds of buildings that we're putting in place. And we're learning from City of Portland on this particular one. This is also an image I borrowed. It's just that idea, and we did that in our linkage document. We basically did this crosswalk where we identified linkages between planning efforts, so it's something you can consider. And just to wrap up, and I know I'm out of time, I think in terms of our implementation, aligning our community climate strategy with other city plans and linking mitigation and adaptation, those are ongoing tasks, right? Like we all know that we have to continually work to integrate these issues into other city plans. We have to encourage that ongoing dialogue between colleagues and with stakeholders in the communities about these issues. And, one way we try to do that is we try to link it with community priorities, whether it's around smart cities, whether it's around equity, co-benefits, the co-benefits, which I think Mike or Jeremy was referencing as well. Those are really important. And I know some of you were interested in monitoring. Surrey has a sustainability dashboard online. We monitor a number of things in terms of our sustainability vision, that Thriving Green Inclusive City vision. So if you can have a look offline, and I'm happy to answer questions about it. And we have a particular subset of measures that we're monitoring around adaptation. So food for thought is my last slide. For us, developing a mitigation and adaptation plan kind of separately but in tandem, and then linking it as we got towards the end of that planning process, it worked really well. I think if you don't have a plan, and this is partly hearing from a lot of American cities that are doing these resilience plans that are integrating, and it's somewhat like what Jeremy's done on the corporate side in Peel. I think if you don't have any plan, you might consider developing an integrated plan. I think that could perhaps facilitate internal dialogue and facilitate those long-term linkages between those issues if you do it in one plan. So it's just an idea. And I think part of that depends on a lot of things, your internal capacity to do one huge plan, or do you do two, do you do mitigation and then an adaptation later? And I think partly it depends on things like your stakeholders and your funding for those planning processes, your community awareness and dialogue around these issues. If you go out and talk to people about resilience, are they going to know what you're talking about? Is it good to talk about mitigation only and then follow up with a different planning process separately around adaptation? That's different for every city. So I'll just leave you with that. That's it. I'm done.
Thank you, Anna. So for the question period, we have a few minutes left, and I will kick it off with the question from the City of Guelph. This is for Jeremy. So do you see your plan more as a phased-out approach, that is corporate first and then community to follow? And then I'll just ask the second question in the interest of time, also for Jeremy. Can you give a brief overview of the phases of your project, as well as give an idea of the resource allotment for the project as well? Jeremy, you might be muted.
Okay, so the original question is it a phased approach with corporate then community? Yes, we are doing it with that approach in mind. Now, this is more on our long-term planning, which is another key piece of our plan. It's a 10-year plan. So that doesn't mean that we aren't currently working on work in the interim, which is what we refer to as our term of council priority work, which is happening in the next couple years. So from a corporate perspective, we're doing some immediate work right now, but this planning is more for our future out to 2030. With that knowledge, it's going to help inform our community work. But as I mentioned earlier in my slides, we also are working with our community in our area municipalities and our conservation authorities on looking at that community planning as well. And hopefully the information that we get through our corporate master plan will help feed and inform the greater community work that's starting to happen right now, but we envision it's going to take a little bit longer to have completed. So that's the thinking around the phasing between the corporate and community work. So yes, that we will be doing that. With regards to the phases to our plan, one of the things that we knew right off the start that was important is to get a current state of our work. So that was one of the first things that we did in developing this plan. There was a lot of stuff going on at the Region Appeal that maybe didn't formally fall under climate change work, and people were just doing it because they knew it was the right thing to do. And this is on both the adaptation and mitigation side. So we wanted to first assess what the current state was and what work people were doing. And then once we had that information, we were able to come forward with a little bit more credibility to these groups when we were proposing new ideas, rather than proposing ideas that people were just saying, well, we've already done that, so why are you suggesting this at this point? So that was the first step to it. Then, yes, we had the conversation about where we wanted to get, what was our mandate, what was our goals, what was our targets, and that was a conversation that we had more with our director level, but then it fed into our working groups and broader staff engagement. And with that knowledge, we then started to look at what types of actions we had to put in place to be able to meet those goals. And with regards to resourcing, we do have 2 staff that are, I'd say, one and a half full-time staff working on this plan, and we also are working with Mike, actually, on this call from ICLEI, is assisting us with the development of the plan as well.
Thank you. I'll pass it on to Anna now. So Anna, this question is from Ted Sheldon, and he was curious to what extent Surrey may be looking at reducing impervious ground surfaces, for example, reducing above-ground parking spaces in new developments to further buffer the heat island effect and enable water back into the natural ground system.
Hi, Ted. Yeah, that's a great question. We've done a lot of different work around kind of those low-impact development, permeable paving. I think we have a lot more that we can be doing. And that, actually, this is a great example, I think, of where we need to continue that internal dialogue. And I'm hoping that urban heat island mapping that we're doing with Portland State could then be overlapped, for example, with our city center plan, where we're expecting a huge amount of development, and then providing further impetus or further rationale for increasing it. So I guess the short answer is yes, we are looking at it. We've done a number of, I don't know if we call them pilots, but we've implemented permeable paving and so on in different developments or required that, but there's certainly more that we can be doing.
Great, thank you. And we're running a bit out of time, but I will try to get the last question in. So for Jeremy, are all regional local municipalities engaged in the implementation of the climate change master plan? This is from Oshawa, Helen Brake.
So all all the area municipalities are involved in the development of our community climate change plan. When it comes to our corporate climate change plan, which is more of what we're doing internally to address our own corporate emissions, there's not quite the same formal governance structure on sharing that information. That said, all of the different managers that are working on our own corporate plans within the municipalities and Peel do meet fairly regularly to share ideas and thoughts on what we're doing within our corporations. So the short answer is yes, we do work with each other, but there's probably more of a greater collaboration on the community front than necessarily within our corporate work.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thanks everyone for asking questions. Unfortunately, we're running a little bit out of time, so I will take all of this. Anna's already answering to some on the chat, but if they were not answered, we'll circulate the responses in the email with the webinar presentation. So I will leave it to Louise to do the last footprints and evaluation notes, and then we can conclude.
Thank you, Anna. Okay, so we'll move on to footprints. For those of you who are new to our webinars, footprints is a calculator, and it calculates the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we have saved by meeting virtually as opposed to meeting in person. So figuratively speaking, if you had all come to Ottawa, including our speakers from wherever you live, we would have expended 24,805 kilograms of carbon dioxide, $67,009.83 in Canadian currency and return travel expenses, and 168,180 kilometers of travel distance. So we've done quite well by meeting virtually as opposed to meeting in person. We'll bring you back now to Anna's concluding slide.
Okay, thank you. So just a reminder, there was an evaluation survey shared in the chat box, so if you could take, it's very short, 5 minutes to respond, that'd be very appreciated. We have an upcoming webinar, Introduction to Climate Change for Elected Officials, Challenges and Opportunities. This is going to take place on January 24th for the French one and January 31st for the English one. A little reminder to register for the Sustainable Communities Conference by December 11th for early bird pricing. The conference is going to take place in February 6th to 8th in Ottawa, and it's going to be great. My contact information is there, and also the link to the PCP Hub, the online tool that I mentioned earlier, where we're going to have a repository of documents and space for more questions and dialogue on the topic. So thank you everyone for joining us, and yeah, as always, if you have any additional questions, please put them in the chat box or direct them to me, and we will be in touch after this. Thank you.
So this concludes today's webinar. I'd like to thank Anna Guerrero, Anna Matthewson, Jeremy Shembry, Michael Deans for this wonderful webinar. Very interesting. I would say it was a great success. Thank you, everyone, and this concludes today's webinar.